right, so we are going to be in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12 today. And to finally answer some of the questions that all of you have been asking or wondering inside your head, what is this chair for? Well, it's for me. I don't think it's fair that everybody else gets to sit down all service long while I have to stand up here. Today we're talking a little bit about rest. And does everybody have a spot in their home? You know that spot that you have where it's a long day, you just can't wait to get home, kick up your feet, get the nice blanket on, and just rest, and oh, it feels good. So that meant my feet were killing me. I've been standing up since 7 in the morning, and I just need to finally find my little place of rest. For a lot of us, this is what we live for. You know, have you ever been in one of those situations where your alarm clock goes off on Monday morning at 7, whoa, and you're still laying inside of bed and you're thinking, man, I can't wait to go back to bed. And you haven't even gotten out of bed yet. Because we live in such a busy world that we oftentimes make rest the most important thing because we never actually get it, and we're not good at planning it, and we're not good at making space for it. But rest is also a big thing in the Bible as well. They called it the Sabbath. They reserved one whole day. And we're going to look at that today. And we're going to see exactly what that meant, exactly how they did it wrong, and exactly how we can learn from that. So unfortunately, I'm not going to preach the entire message from this chair, although it is pretty nice. But we're going to be in Matthew chapter 12 today. And looking about how to find rest in Christ. Finding rest in Christ. The first point as you make your way over there, if you have the bulletin, is that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, so stop treating rest as Lord. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, so stop treating rest as Lord. Let's go ahead and get started in Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. It says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look what your disciples are doing, what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Let's stop there here. So what we find in this story is now that Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field. And while they're walking through a grain field, one of them gets hungry. My money's on Peter. I don't have a reason why. It just seems like he would do this. He grabs a handful of grain, rubs it in his hand, blows off the chaff, and then eats a few of it. And in that moment, they are now accused of breaking the Sabbath. Now, if you don't know what the Sabbath means, what we're talking about, it's one of the 10 commandments. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's the 7th day of the week, so it'd be Saturday. And for that Saturday, for the Jewish person, they were supposed to not work or not do anything strenuous on that day. They were supposed to have a complete day of rest. And this was at the point of the New Testament upheld rigorously, strictly, that you did not break this law. It was probably one of the top laws that just defined who you are. The entire nation would shut down on the Sabbath. And so they're walking through a field now, and one of them grabs some grain. And now for us in the 21st century Americans, we say, well, that's not right. You don't just walk through a field. We have lots of orchards and things around here. We know we can't just walk up to a tree that's not our property and take an orange and eat it. That's not something you do. In that time period, that was allowed. That was okay. There was actually laws built into place where they couldn't harvest the edges of their fields and to leave it for the poor and the needy, and you could always walk through the field and grab a handful. You couldn't bring a whole basket and I'm going shopping for the week now. But for the poor and the needy, there were systems set in place that God set in place, and Jesus and his disciples counted as the poor and needy at that time. They were homeless, they were wandering around, and they didn't have anything to eat. And so as they were walking through the fields, one of them got hungry and started to eat, or maybe a few of them got hungry and started to eat. Now, what's significant about that is not that they did that, but yet that it was on the Sabbath. They were in the Sabbath. A couple reasons why that's significant. Number one, what they had done in that period is they were so worried against the law, what they ended up doing, they said, well, the Bible says we ought to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And so instead of just make sure that we remember it and keep it holy, let's establish additional rules to make sure we don't even get close to breaking what God said. And so they started making rule upon rule upon rule, and then get more and more strict. One of those rules is that you couldn't walk more than 3,000 feet away from your house. So you could walk a little bit, but then you had to come back. But just like with any man-made religion, they also built in some loopholes. And so what they would do oftentimes is they would say, you can walk 3,000 feet, but hey, good news, we set up a small little booth or a small little stool, and if you sit down for a few minutes and you say the prayer and you say the right words, then you now have established that small little booth as your home. And then you can walk another 3,000 miles, and then there's another little booth, and you can set up that little booth as your small little home. And so there was rule upon rule, but they also built in loopholes, because that's what man-made religion does. It's all about rule keeping. It's all about what can I do, not about what Jesus did. But in the midst of that, we know we can't actually keep all the rules, and so we build in loopholes. And so Jesus and his disciples might have already been breaking that 3,000-foot rule, which it wasn't a sin. There's nothing in the Bible about that, but yet that's just how they interpreted it. So they were walking through the fields, and one of them grabs grain. And I love this because it says, as soon as he starts to eat it, it says the Pharisees saw it, and they said to him, look what your disciples are doing. The word behold, look at this. And my question is, how'd the Pharisees see it? Were they just following Jesus and his disciples through this grain field? In my mind, I went back to if you ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, where all the main characters are running through a field of tall grass, and they're running, and then raptors are just getting them off one by one. Like, I kind of envision, like, one of the disciples just grabbing some food and starting to eat it, and then a Pharisee pops up. Sinner! Where did they even come from in this moment? They were so quick to look. They were looking for ways to accuse them, and they say they're doing things that are not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Once again, they did nothing wrong, but the Pharisees had created quite the system. Let me just share a few of the things that they have now created. None of these are actually sinful actions to do on the Sabbath according to the Bible, but according to their oral tradition, they said that there was a long list of forbidden fruit. And this long list is too long to list here, but if you had forbidden fruit, you couldn't eat anything more than something of an olive. Something of an olive was on there. And let's say if you just took half of a bite of an olive and it was rotten and you spit it out, too bad, you can't eat another olive because that one counted already. So you couldn't even eat any small little item because that was too much work. You couldn't throw something up with one hand and catch it with the other hand. Too bad if you're a juggler, like you were out of luck there, but that was considered work. You couldn't even, if you were a tailor, you couldn't carry needles because it might tempt you to work. If you were a scribe, you couldn't carry pens. If you were a student, you couldn't carry your books because you might be tempted to read. If it's on Friday night and it's sundown and it's about ready to be the Sabbath and you reach out and you grab food and then all of a sudden the sun goes down and it's the Sabbath, you better drop it right there. You're not allowed to lift it up to your mouth because it might be caught in the Sabbath. Even today it's carried on that if you go to Israel on the Sabbath day and you're on the 10th floor of a hotel room, you better be ready to wait because it has to stop at every single floor because you can't actually push the button. So this is even going on today. But it's in that time period, you couldn't actually light a fire. You could pour cold water on warm water, but you could not pour warm water on cold water. If you had a chair, you couldn't move it. If you couldn't light a candle, you couldn't even blow it out if it was lit already. You couldn't take a bath, because what if some of the water spills out and you would be cleaning the floor? Women, you couldn't look at yourself in the reflection because you might be tempted to do makeup or fix your hair or something like that. So all of this has created such a system that God had set aside a day for rest, a day that is designed to help his people, and they ended up in their man-made religion and made it more work to keep the Sabbath than to just go to work. And that's what man-made religion does. It is always trying to keep the rules, to establish yourself, saying, I can do this by myself. If I keep enough of those rules, I can make God happy. I can earn my salvation. And that's what the Pharisees were operating as, and that's what they were trying to hold Jesus to as well. But let's see how Jesus answers him now in verse 3. It says, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. So he makes a reference to 1 Samuel chapter 21. We don't have time to read through it all, but 1 Samuel 21 is a story there of whenever David is really running away from King Saul. And during that time period, he was running away from King Saul, and his men were hungry. And they came to the house of God, and there was a priest there. And so they came into the house of God and said, hey, you know me, I'm David. And he actually lies, and he said, well, I'm on a special mission from King Saul, but my men are hungry. And so the priest, he has this food here, but it's holy bread. It was something that only the priests were allowed to eat. Nobody else was allowed to eat it. And the priest says, I don't know. But the David said, we're hungry. And it's like, okay, I'll go ahead and give it to you. And they eat it. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it actually ever condemn David for doing that. And in fact, Jesus says, listen, you guys, you respect David. You know King David. You hold him up on a mantle above everybody else almost in the entire history of the world. And yet he went in and he broke the law, the ceremonial law, which was part of the Old Testament. And you don't actually hold him accountable for that. Now, in this moment, what Jesus is doing for the next few verses, he's also showing himself as more of a king than King David. He's comparing himself to King David. He said, you didn't hold King David and his men to that standard. Well, now I'm your new king, and these are my new men, and this is the same situation. And so he says, so first he mentions that. And then in verse 5, he comes back and he says, or have you not read the law? How on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless. Now this was, if we were there, if you've ever been in a situation where two people might be in a little bit of an argument, maybe if you've been watching some of those debates, the presidential debates or everything like that, and for whatever reason, I just enjoy watching. I enjoy watching other people fight. It brings me joy for some reason. But you know, they come back with a one-liner, and you're like, oh no, they're done. They just gotta quit. They gotta go home. They gotta retire because of that one line. Well, this was a one-liner by Jesus that would have stuck straight to their heart. Because he says, have you not read the law? That was a sarcastic, metaphorical slap in the face of the Pharisees right there. Because the Pharisees, they read the law. They memorized the entire law. Do you understand that? Many of them had the first 5 books of the Bible memorized. That's about 200 pages worth of memorizing in this Bible. They had it memorized. They lived it. They held everyone to the rigorous standards, not only of that, but on laws, on top of laws, on top of laws. And Jesus is like, haven't you even read the thing? Haven't you seen that? And then for everybody else, you don't insult a Pharisee like that. But they read it, but they never understood it. They never lived it. And he says, what about the priests? See, because the priests, they would have to go in at that point before Jesus actually died. They would go in and they would have to start a fire. And then they would have to go find 2 lambs. They actually had double the work on the Sabbath. They would have to go find a lamb, and they would have to kill it. And then they would have to cut it up and fillet it up and skin it. And if you've ever done any of that, then that's hard work. That's not easy. That's a messy, dirty, stinky, disgusting job. And they were doing all of that on the Sabbath. And then after that, they would take all of that meat and go throw it up onto an altar. That's a lot more than a dried olive that you were allowed to normally carry. And so Jesus says, what about the priests? Every single day, every single Sabbath, they do all of these things, and you never hold them accountable for any of it. What about that? And they didn't have an answer for that. Well, it's just, we don't know. This is the way it's always been done. It was written in the law like that the priest couldn't, that's what they were supposed to do. And so Jesus, once again, is pinpointing them and saying, yeah, you're keeping the law, but you're missing the whole point of it. There's something greater, and he says that here now in verse 6. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. So he starts out in verse 6 and says, something greater than the temple is here, which he's talking about himself. But in the Jewish mind, that was impossible. The temple was absolutely everything. To have the temple, to keep the temple, to recognize the temple was everything to them, the most important thing to them. He says something is greater than that is here. And then he quotes in verse 7, he quotes out of Hosea 6:6, for the second time in the book of Matthew. He says, once again to the Pharisees, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I desire mercy. I want you to have mercy towards others instead of just feeling like you're self-righteous. Because that sacrifice, what they were doing, all it was just to puff them up, to make them feel better about themselves and say, well, look at me, I'm more holy than everybody else. And so I can look down on everybody else. But Jesus says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Some of us have been Christians for very long times, and it's easy to slip into this, is it not? We come at it and we say, well, I haven't cussed in 10 years. I haven't watched an R-rated movie in 20 years. I haven't done all of this because I love the Lord, but yet we've never helped somebody else out in need. We've never given $1 to a homeless man, much less invited him into our home. We never have done anything like that. And Jesus is like, yeah, good for you on all of this. That's great. But if it doesn't correspond, if it doesn't overflow out of you to also have mercy and love for others, then you're missing the entire point. And he says in verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath of the Sabbath. Oftentimes today, you'll hear Muslims or Jehovah's Witnesses or even atheists, agnostics will say things like, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Because if you read through the New Testament, if you read through the Gospels, never once did Jesus say, my name is Jesus and I'm God. He doesn't actually say those direct words, and so they say, well, he never claimed to even be God. But if they knew anything at all, you would know that verse 8 is one of the most profound statements of deity in the entire New Testament. Because all throughout the Old Testament, it talks about how it's God's Sabbath. It's his day of rest. It is all his. And so he says the Son of Man, which is a term for the Messiah, which he was referring to himself. So he's saying, I'm the Messiah. The Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. He's saying, I am doing something that only God can do. And I am God. That wasn't going to sit well with the Pharisees at all. So let's see how they respond now as we go on to our second point in our outline in the bulletin here, is that we are free to do good, so stop making excuses. We are free to do good, so stop making excuses. Verse 9. He went on from there and entered their synagogue. And a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. So I just, once again, love the fact that Jesus was very bold. So after this confrontation, did you notice this is their synagogue? He's like, I'm not going to the next town. I'm going to Sunday night service in their town. And they were waiting for him. They had a man that they probably had known about. I mean, we don't know for sure, but they probably, my guess is that they might have planned all of this. They had a man with a withered hand. That word withered is literally like a dry piece of fruit, that there was nothing pumping through it. And so we don't know how he got this injury. We don't know why he got this injury. It probably was not a life-threatening injury. It's probably one that he's had for some time, which is significant because, once again, remember all those rules? Here's another couple rules. They said if there was somebody that had an accident and was dying, you were allowed to save them on the Sabbath, but you weren't allowed to help heal them. Meaning that if somebody had an accident, broke their leg, and was bleeding out, you could tie a tourniquet around it and stop the bleeding, but you couldn't reset the leg. They'd have to sit in pain for that entire day until the next day and risk worse injury. And so for them, that's once again just not in the Bible, but extra rules that they added on and said, no, if you want to keep the Sabbath, then you can't actually really help anybody out. It's all for the Lord, not realizing that helping people out is also for the Lord, even more in a greater way. And so they asked him there, they say, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And so that they might accuse him. They had very ulterior motives, and everybody knew it, and Jesus knew it. He was not surprised by this. Because in verse 11, he answers them. And And he said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Oh, how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So he, once again, knows exactly how to get at the Pharisees. He says, which one of you guys, the sheep falls down into a pit? And they can't get out. How many of you are just going to let that sheep die? The answer is nobody would let that sheep die because that sheep was money to them. That was their livelihood. And so they would figure out a way. There's debate on this, whether if they just allowed it to, if one of your animals fell in a pit, if you were just allowed to do it. Some people said, well, maybe they just found a way around it. So maybe they got like 10 different guys to pull on a rope, so it's just barely a little bit of effort by each one. Maybe that was the way they got it out. But one way or the other, he's saying you would not let that sheep die because that's valuable to you. Well, that person sitting right beside you is way more valuable than that. That homeless man, the people that we see on the news, all of them are more valuable than our sacrifice, more valuable than anything else that's going on. Because they have the image of God in their life. And he says, you would save them, but you won't save this man? It's always a good time to do the right thing. In verse 13, he says, then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. The man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. And Matthew tells this story. Luke and Mark also tell the exact same story, and they add some extra detail in there. They actually say that Jesus called the man up to the front of the auditorium. He said, come here. And right in front of everybody, as everybody's looking, he says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? And he says, then stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was healed. Now in that moment, all Jesus did was say the words. And for Jesus, the one who could say words and really invent the entire universe, just say it to exist, and all of a sudden all of this is here, it wasn't work for him at all to say to this man to stretch out his hand. It was less work for him than it was for them to keep their heart beating. Like it was nothing for Jesus at all for him to heal that man. And he was making a point. But yet, did you see how they responded? They were not rejoicing over the fact that a lame man has finally been restored, that there's a miraculous healing in their sight. They went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. Verse 14. The word destroyed is a very strong word. It makes no doubt that they were starting to conspire to kill him. Now here's the problem. Jesus wasn't going to die for another 2 years. 2 years. And so for the next 2 years, this is really starting to be chapter 12, chapter 13, is all this turning point where the Jewish nation finally say, reject Jesus and say, yeah, we enjoyed it while you were just doing miracles in the way that we wanted you to. But as soon as you started pressing against us, as soon as you started to disagree against us, you are no longer with us and we are ready to kill you. And so for the next 2 chapters, which are long chapters, it's going to take us quite a few weeks to get through the next couple, but we're going to see that Jesus now starts to turn his attention from the nation of Israel and says, no, this is for the whole entire world as well. This is all planned out. But it brings us to our third and final point here now, which is to stop looking for rest. Look for Jesus and then find rest. Stop looking for rest. Look for Jesus and then find rest. Before we get on any farther, I do want to answer one question, though. A question that I get somewhat frequently. It's, so as Christians, are we called to keep the Sabbath? Is it something that we are required to do, or are we not required to do? Which, in one sense, is kind of even a crazy question that I ask it, because once again, it's on the top 10, it's on the 10 Commandments, and you're never going to hear me say, as Christians, are we called to murder or not murder? And so, why is this even a subject matter? We talked about this a little bit in the past, and so I'll just kind of briefly summarize it. But the Sabbath It was something that God did, obviously, whenever He created everything in 6 days, and then on the seventh day He had a day of rest. It was not actually commanded to be followed until the law came around, until the Ten Commandments, until the Mosaic law came around. And at that point, then He started to say, you must have the Sabbath day. You came out of Egypt where you were a slave, where you worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you never had one day of rest for hundreds of years. Then He says, I want you to keep the Sabbath in order that you might remember everything that I've done for you. And so he says to keep the Sabbath in the Mosaic law. But whenever Jesus comes and He fulfills that law. And no longer do we have to follow any of the law in the Old Testament. And that includes the Sabbath. It includes all the other Old Testament laws as well. Murder, adultery, all of that. We're no longer held to that. The only laws that we're required to keep are the ones that are repeated in the New Testament. Repeated in the New Testament. If you were to read through the New Testament, you would find that there are 9 of them that are repeated to keep. There's one of them that's not repeated to keep. Any guesses on what that one that is not repeated in the New Testament? The Sabbath. The Sabbath. And furthermore, it even is a stronger argument because Paul says in Colossians 2:16, I don't have it on the screen, but it says in 2:16, therefore let no one pass judgment on you in question of food or drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And so Paul says that Sabbath in the Old Testament was something that just pointed to Jesus. It was a symbolic gesture to say, yeah, we're going to have rest one day a week because one day we're going to be able to find our rest in Jesus Christ. And so for us, though, that still presents a problem. So you're saying, are we supposed to work 7 days a week and never have a day off? Some of us get excited about that, honestly. I'm somebody that is very bad at rest. I probably did not go to bed before 2 in the morning once this week. That's not good. I'm not bad. It's hard for me to rest. And the Bible doesn't say that I have to. It's not a sin not to take a Sabbath. But yet, let me ask you one other question. Should we take a rest? Should we take time each week, every day? Yes. Yes, we should. So it's not a sin not to have the Sabbath, not to take all day Saturday off or all day Sunday off or whatever, because some of us, for a lot of us, we think of Sabbath as Sunday because we went to church as little kids and then we had to stay inside all day and we couldn't go outside and play because it was the Sabbath, right? But should we still take time off? Yes. And we should do the exact same thing that the Jews in the Old Testament were doing. They should have a time to remember what the Lord has done for us. And so it's more than just sitting down in this chair. The Sabbath rest is more just sitting down in this chair this afternoon and taking a nap and then turning on some football and just resting. It's more than that. It's a time to specifically set a time aside, time to remember what the Lord has done for us, to remember our salvation, to reflect on Him. So must we keep the Sabbath? No. Should we keep a Sabbath rest? Yes. Let's keep going on here now. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. Verse 15. Jesus aware of this. Verse 15. Let me give you, I gave it to you. All right. Verse 15 now. Jesus aware of this withdrew from there, and many followed Him, and He healed them all, and ordered them not to make Him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. That they were about ready to destroy Him, that they wanted to kill Him, so He had to withdraw from there. So one, how sad of it that Jesus had to withdraw at all. There are churches, I'm thankful that this is not one of them, but the opposite, that I've been to churches where you can see God moving and working and there's a presence there, but then all of a sudden people say, yeah, I know God's moving and working, but I don't like it the way that He's doing it. And we're not going to do that. We're going to put a stop to that. We're not going to let this type of activity, this new life, spring forth. And they put a stop to it. And then you can just feel the Spirit leaving, withdrawing. How often does that happen? It's so tragic. And Jesus physically left from there because they were about to kill Him. And once again, he had an appointment with the cross 2 years later. And He could not be killed by the mob yet. And many followed Him. And He healed them all. He still was having compassion
compassion on them. But verse 16 is unusual when he says, and order them not to make him known. Order them not to make him known. We ask, did Jesus do this? Why did he? This is the third time in the book of Matthew alone that we've seen Jesus commit a miracle and then say, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody about me. And so, one, we see probably because there are people trying to kill him, and this was a little bit of a crowd control measure there, that he's saying, no, people are after me, don't tell anybody here, because they're going to just come and it's going to be a problem once again. But even more than that, I think that what's interesting is whenever there was a miracle in the Old Testament, you had to then go to the temple and you had to present yourself to a priest. And that priest would take a look at you, and then there'd be a little bit of a waiting period to make sure that you were really healed. And then the priest could finally say, yes, there's a miracle, this man is healed of whatever was wrong with him. See, if they didn't tell them about Jesus, it doesn't say don't tell anybody that you got healed. It says don't tell anybody that I did it. If they didn't tell anybody about that, they would go to the temple, they would present themselves to the priest. The priest would say, it's a miracle, praise the Lord. What happened? Oh, you've officially given your stamp on it? Then I'll tell you that Jesus did it. It was a way for them to say, it was a way for Jesus to have all his miracles acknowledged in a way that they couldn't say, no, it's Jesus, and it couldn't have been a miracle. It was only something, demon possession or something like that we're going to get into next week. Let's finish off here. There's one more quote, a few more verses, and then we'll be done. Verse 18. It says, behold my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry aloud. He will not anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. He quotes verses, it's really more of a paraphrase. It's not an exact quote, from Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 3. And we see this messianic passage that starts to talk about that it's talking from God's perspective that he is chosen. That word chosen in verse 18, it's a very strong word, almost like the word adopted, like Jesus, God said, I had a plan, and this is the one. Jesus Christ, my son, is the one that's going to come. Then he says, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased, I will put my spirit on him. And we say, doesn't Jesus always have the spirit on him? Yes, but then there's also times when the spirit came down, which we're going to see as we continue on in the Gospels. It's a beautiful picture of the Trinity. But what I love about this is that twice in these passages here, it says the word Gentiles. It doesn't say the word Gentiles in Isaiah, in the Hebrew version of this. It says the earth. But Jesus was specifically showing, Matthew was specifically showing, that not only is it for the Jews and all the earth, but it's also for the Gentiles, which is good news for most of us here today. That Jesus now said, my nation has rejected me, but I have not rejected the nations. And he says some interesting lines there. In verse 20, he says, a bruised reed he will not break. In that time period, there's lots of reeds. Whenever there's kind of marshland, you see those long, it looks like long grass, but they're actually reeds. And oftentimes they would cut it into pieces and cut little holes in it, and then you could go around and play the flute. Maybe as shepherds or little boys, oftentimes we just cut up in a reed and we'd play the flute, a little handmade flute, and that was just a fun activity to do. But if after you do that for a little while, just the spit and the saliva starts to wilt it, and no longer can it even work. It's useless. But Jesus says, that the bruised reed, I won't throw it away. And then he says after that, the wick that's just smoldering. If you've ever seen a candle that finally gets down to the very bottom, and you can't even light the very bottom. All it does is just puff up black smoke, and it's completely useless. It doesn't give any light. It doesn't give any heat. All of this is completely useless. And Jesus says, I'm not going to put it out. What Jesus is saying is that Gentiles, you got a lot of issues. You're bruised up, you're beat up, you're sinful, you got problems. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm here for you as well. And he says at the end of verse 20,
the end of summer break. I'm hoping that for the majority of you that you got at least a little bit of a summer break. If you're like me, we went up to the mountains for a few days and came back. And as soon as I got back, I said, man, I need a vacation. I need a vacation from my vacation. Has anybody else ever said that or been there? Amen. See, what I've found here is that so often, because we're so busy, because we work so hard, because we're always pushing and we're always pushing and we're always pushing, then at a certain point we just oftentimes burn out and break down where we can't do anything else, and we just like, I need rest, and then we get rest, and then it's like it didn't really help. It's similar if you were a marathon runner and you had to run 24 miles, God bless you, but if you had to run 24 miles and at 23 miles, no matter how in condition you are, I don't care if you're from Jamaica or Kenya and you're just have that running gene in your bones there and you're just great, but at 23 miles and 24 miles, you're ready to quit. No matter what, you're just thinking, I need a rest, I need to sit down. And you just think, if I can just sit down for 5 minutes, I'm going to sit down here and I'm just going to rest and then I'll be fine and I'll get up and I'll go. But if you ever run at all, the moment that you sit down, you ain't getting back up again. that effort from the floor up to your feet again is going to be harder than the first 23 miles that you run. You know what's going to get you if you're at mile 28 to mile 24? It's the hope of the finish line. It's hope. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, you're looking for rest. You have made this whole orchestra to give you rest, and you think that just rest in and of itself is going to solve all your problems. And Jesus is saying, no, you don't need rest, you need hope. You need hope. And so for many of us here today, I think the reason why resting, though, is so hard, the reason why this has not come naturally to me or to many others of us, is because, it's hard to work really hard when you're sitting down and resting in the Lord. Because for us, we want to work. And whenever we work, we feel like we're in control, right? If I'm working harder than the next guy, then I'm going to make more money than him. And if I make more money, then I'm going to provide for my family and everything's going to be all right because I worked hard and I did it by myself. But that moment when we sit down and we say, God, I can't do this. I need you to take over for me. That's when we find rest. And we can't truly rest in the Lord when we're trying to work ourselves. And so for so many of us, I want to give you permission as a pastor. Not that you need my permission, but I'm going to give it to you. That you have a moment. You have permission to rest. And in that rest, don't just rest. Don't just take a nap. Don't just feel like you can just shut everything off and shut off the world and just hide in your hole, but rather run to the Lord. It was no mistake that Jesus quoted out of Isaiah 42. Just a chapter before that. Isaiah 43, you remember those verses. He who waits on the Lord will not grow weary. He'll mount up like wings, like eagles. Even the young men will run and not go faint. Jesus is saying, come to me. If you come to me, you're going to find rest in me. If you go try to find rest in anywhere else, you're never going to find it. But come to me, and you're going to find rest for your weary souls. Do you remember how Jesus ended all the last chapter? Are you heavy? Laden and burden, come to me and you're going to find rest for your weary souls. We're going to sing one more song. I invite you to close your eyes and bow your heads for just a moment. If you are like me, and let me tell you, when I was preaching this message to myself like never before this week. And God, I need to find my rest in you. I need to trust you. I need to know that you're going to have it even when I am resting in you. That you're not going to take your hands off the wheel and I put my hands towards you. If you're like me and you know that you need prayer for that, I'm just offering prayer for Father, we love you. Lord, we know that we can rest in you because you have already won all the battles that we're ever going to have to fight. That you have promised us everything that we ever are going to need to live a godly life in you. Lord, we are sorry. I am sorry, Lord. For when I sin against that, I think that I can do it all myself. That I can just grit my teeth and do it all, everything, and I don't need your help. And so, Lord, we are sorry. I am sorry for that. I pray that we would learn to trust in you more, to find our rest, to find our peace, to find our satisfaction in you and only you and in nothing else, Lord, knowing that you are going to provide everything that we need whenever we need. We love you, Lord. I pray now as we sing this last worship song that you would be pleased with us, your children. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We stand and sing.